People do terrible things to people. You've lived with that your whole life. You may think that basically it is competition for space, resources, or mates that causes it. But cooperation offers more and is safer than conflict, so that explanation simply does not work. The basic cause is far more profound and is at the heart of biology. Why are people so inhumanly terrible in the way we treat other humans? We all can see the advantages of cooperating, but so often hate gets in the way. The reason is that it is a matter of babies. It all depends on babies. Nothing else is so important. Where did the babies go? How bad will it get? We shall start cute. This will get grim soon enough. Imagine an island. There are 3 kinds of bugs on the island: big, middle, and little. Generally they manage. They find enough to eat. Rarely one kind may go extinct. Rarely a new kind shows up. There are a lot of them, but not an unlimited number. This is an animal we shall call a box. It eats bugs on the island. There are 3 kinds of boxen on the island: spotted, striped, and wavy, and they eat the big, middle, and little bugs. So things are reasonably stable. Each kind of box has its own kind of bug and is optimized for hunting that kind of bug. For the time being, there is no great pressure to change. We call each kind of bug and each kind of box a different species. With rare exceptions, animals of different species cannot have fertile offspring if they mate. Sometimes a species can break in two. This is called speciation. You may not have heard it, may not like it, you may not believe it, but it sure looks like it happens, so we're going with it. You can go back later and throw it out if you'd like. I'd rather that than lose you now. Just be sure you understand. A new bug comes to the island. It's only pretty big. Either the spotted or the striped boxen could eat it. Now suppose that the spotted box is fast at speciation. It quickly becomes a new species as well as being the old one. So the spotted box has done well. It has 2 kinds of offspring, and even if one of those kinds of bug, the big or the pretty big, goes extinct, there will still be offspring from the spotted box. On the other hand, let us say that the striped box undergoes speciation very slowly. It can feed on either the pretty big or the middle kind of bug, but is not optimal for either. While it's dithering, the spotted box takes over the new kind of bug, and there is a fair chance that the wavy box will undergo speciation and take over the middle as well as its own little species. The striped box might go extinct even though its main food source was always there. The moral is that rapid speciation is sometimes a good thing. Things are always changing, old niches close and new ones open. In order to stay adaptable and compete, any species is under enormous selective pressure to be able to undergo speciation fairly quickly. They say Alfred Russel Wallace was aware of this. Apparently Charles Darwin just couldn't see it. It is rarely mentioned these days. But sometimes rapid speciation can be a problem. You know about genes and chromosomes. Genes and some other things line up on chromosomes. Generally speaking, it is the difference between our chromosomes that makes us different individuals and different species. Consider some animals in a valley. There is a chromosome in one of the animals. The chromosome replicates as chromosomes will, and the two copies wind up in different animals. They are still about as alike as chromosomes get to be. One of the animals hops over to the other side of the valley. A glacier splits the valley and separates the animals for 2,000 generations. We sometimes say F and then some number when we are counting generations. There is no consensus on how long speciation takes. I generally say 2,000 generations because it works out with other numbers, but obviously that's a round number. It's just a guess. You may make any guess you like, but don't, for instance, say 200,000 generations. A human generation is roughly 30 years, maybe 32, and a chimpanzee generation is about 25 years. So if we go back 200,000 generations, that's 5 or 6 million years. Back then, we and chimpanzees had a common ancestor. Since then, chimpanzees are split into two species, and humans, well, we weren't even human back then, were we? We had to change into a number of things before we became humans, and then there have been a number of different kinds of human, Neanderthals and so forth. So choose whatever number you like and adjust the arithmetic that follows, but don't go overboard. A very big number just isn't possible. I'm staying with 2,000. So after 2,000 generations, the glacier melts. Now animals from one side of the valley can once again get together with animals from the other side of the valley. But they can't have fertile offspring. They are different species. Speciation has occurred. But now suppose it's not a glacier. There are just 1,000 animals in the valley, and they're hopping around mating at random. Since every animal has two copies of the chromosome, and we're ignoring sex chromosomes, that's 2,000 chromosomes of that kind in the valley. Now it will take, on average, about 2,000 generations for any one chromosome or a part of a chromosome to get back to its nearest relative. By that time, the chromosomes can't recognize each other. Speciation has occurred just as surely as if there had been a glacier. The whole valley dies. Sometimes fast speciation is bad. Obviously, nature is under strong selective pressure to put in a fix so populations are able to compete but aren't destroyed just when they're getting successful and the numbers are up. We have looked at rate of speciation. Nature is under pressure to compromise between speciation that is too fast and speciation that is too slow. Nature is also compelled to make a compromise between reproduction that is too fast and reproduction that is too slow. In the long run, only a population growth rate of 0 is good. Grow at a negative rate too long and you go extinct. Grow at a positive rate too long, and when the population gets too big, eventually speciation effects cut in and the population goes extinct, as we have seen. So what do we expect for the relationship between population size and a population growth rate? It would be understandable if you guessed this. If the population gets too small, it ought to have reduced fertility because of inbreeding. And if it gets too big, it ought to have reduced growth rate because of environmental limitations, predators, and disease. But a moment's reflection shows that this is a very poor shape for the curve of growth rate against population size. When a population has been reduced to very low numbers, it should get a big boost in its growth rate. If you add inbreeding depression to its other problems, extinction seems likely. On the other hand, given that there is a strict limit on population size, as we saw in the valley of the chromosomes, something ought to limit population size long before the environment's limit is reached. Besides, quite informally, if you wander around looking at wild animals or just pictures of wild animals, they don't look like they are starving or sickly. They don't look like they are constantly frantic about predators. They just go about their business. Sure, they're young. It's a jungle out there. That's why they look so good. But starving and disease-ridden? In a constant state of terror? Not so much. We all wish birds would stay farther away from jets at airports. So what you would do if you were somehow making choices for nature is you'd make the curve go the other way, like this. Here's what we'd do if we had a choice. A nice boost to fertility if things get bad and the population has serious losses, and a gentle but firm depression of fertility below replacement level into negative growth long before there is any evidence of environmental limitations. The level where the population is stable can be maintained indefinitely. Any small displacement will be met by a slight corrective change in fertility. With anything like luck, a moderate displacement will come back to stability with a series of decreasing overshoots. There should be damped oscillation, which would be the hallmark of stability. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. In this case, it is the former curve that is the extraordinary claim. It is unstable. The expected claim is the one we are looking at, the one that is inherently stable. What we would like to have happen is for a scientist to run out into a field and count all the animals of some species, and then return on the same day the next year and for several years and repeat the count. Then he would publish his data. That may seem like a lot to ask, but in fact it was done not once or twice, but roughly 1,700 times. What's even better is that some people gathered all those studies, analyzed them, and published a summary. Sure enough, what is actually going on in nature is the stable arrangement we are looking at, not the silly unstable one. The team that did it was led by Richard Sibley. They published in 2005. It's all well and good to say a boost in fertility, but the language isn't set up that way. All we have is normal and two kinds of infertility. They are pre-zygotic infertility and post-zygotic infertility. The terms aren't very helpful unless you know what a zygote is. It's Greek for yolk. Hold the puns, let me explain. Here we have doodles for sperm, egg, zygote, dividing zygote, and taxpayer. They go together like this. The sperm and the egg get together and form a zygote, which starts dividing until a new individual adult emerges. Anything that keeps the sperm from reaching and entering the egg is said to be prezygotic. Anything that prevents the zygote from going on to be a fertile adult is postzygotic. Don't feel bad if that seems confusing. You have company. The egg and sperm came from adults in the first place. It's a cycle. What happens afterwards in one generation is earlier than the next. Don't worry, the computer is very strict in demanding that they be treated differently, and we're going to go with it. If you don't like it, you can throw it out later. Right now, just understand and stay with me. So our boost in fertility just means that there was an element of prezygotic or postzygotic infertility, or a combination that has been reduced. I wrote a computer program in C++ language that modeled a population subject to post-zygotic or pre-zygotic infertility, or the combination produced by increased population size. I ran it in C++ and then took the output, which was the number of offspring in the population each generation, and copied it into Excel, which made it possible to graph the results. Of course, there were a number of parameters to tweak, but one pattern I was able to produce was this. This is the output of a virtual population with a pure post-zygotic mechanism of restricted fertility. As you can see, after 3 cycles of damped oscillation, the fertility wanders a bit and then tends to settle down, just as we suspected it might, looking at the real-world data from the Sibley team. This was published in the journal African Entomology, along with a report of finding the same pattern in a captive population of fruit flies. A very similar pattern had been demonstrated in a captive population of blowflies by a man named Nicholson, working in Australia. More recently, the same pattern was described in European voles. I was able to, with the help of the program, to demonstrate damped oscillation of the population using a post-zygotic mechanism. However, try as I might, I was unable to accomplish this with a pure pre-zygotic mechanism. What I consistently found was something like this. After the initial steep rise, the population declines, begins to look like it is leveling off, and then abruptly collapses. This mechanism basically offers a small depression or extinction. It is hard to see any selective advantage to it, and indeed, high-grade pre-zygotic infertility is not seen in nature as an early change. Individuals from completely different species may yet have hybrid offspring in the first generation. Of course, just because I am unable to demonstrate damped population oscillation with a pure pre-zygotic mechanism does not of itself mean nobody can. Maybe somebody is cleverer than I, has better work habits, equipment, networking skills. Maybe it can be done, but at present I do not believe it. So the damped oscillation is the hallmark of the post-zygotic infertility mechanism. There is evidence for the pattern, and thus for post-zygotic infertility, from increased population size in insects and mammals, so one might guess it is widespread. In fact, since pre-zygotic infertility seems such a poor way to go, and no infertility with unlimited population size means no speciation and resulting extinction, we can just about say categorically that post-zygotic infertility is universal. You may not like that. You may not believe it. No matter. You can throw it away later if you like. I confess it's not proven. Reasonable, I think so. Proven, not really. There is another difference between pre-zygotic and post-zygotic infertility caused by excess population size as modeled by the computer. That difference is how fertility changes as inbreeding is approached. Here are the two compared. Look how fertility changes with very small populations depending on whether the mechanism is pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. As you can see in this set of runs with pure post-zygotic infertility, as the population gets smaller, moving toward the left, fertility rises, going up, just as Sibley showed in real life. But at very low population sizes, fertility falls, just as we would expect. We all know there is such a thing as inbreeding depression. Compare that with a pure pre-zygotic mechanism. Lower population, higher fertility. No breath of inbreeding depression. So inbreeding depression is the hallmark of a post-zygotic mechanism. Since there is enormous selective pressure to have post-zygotic fertility depression, which entails inbreeding depression, there's no obvious advantage to inbreeding depression alone. We think inbreeding depression is a side effect of a post-zygotic infertility mechanism. The mechanism for post-zygotic fertility depression from inadequate kinship, which is to say excess population size, must be epigenetic. Let me explain a bit. I think of a gene as being the instructions for making a protein, and I think of the protein as sort of like a tool. That's very oversimplified, but consider the protein that is the enzyme called amylase. That enzyme cuts starches up into sugars. The brain uses a lot of sugar, but starch never gets into the brain. So you want amylase to work in your saliva and bowel, but you'd just as soon not have it in your brain, which is doing a whole lot of other things. So if you have a gene for making amylase, remember this is the simple version, you want it turned off in the brain. The definition is any process not itself a gene that turns the gene on or off is called an epigenetic process. On that line of reasoning, the genes are the tools and the epigenetic signals are carrying the instructions. Genes are made of DNA, which, largely thanks to an efficient repair mechanism, is very stable. Changes, mutations happen, but rarely. Epigenetic changes happen faster. After all, it doesn't take that many gene divisions before cells that will develop into salivary glands separate out from cells that will develop into brain. The idea that there is significant epigenetic information that carries from one generation to the next is not one of the most well agreed upon points of science, but it looks like it does, so we're going with it. Yes, this is another thing you can go back to later and check out if you like, but bear with me for now. One commonly spoken of epigenetic signal is called methylation. That means a methyl group has been attached to the DNA. A methyl group is related to methane, good old cooking gas. In this diagram, methane is shown. C is carbon, H is hydrogen, and the little lines are chemical bonds. A methyl group is shown, which is methane with a missing hydrogen and an open bond. If you hook a methyl group onto a gene, the gene's function may change. Hook a number of methyl groups on and you can have a distinctive pattern, which is similar to the pattern of close relatives. Related genomes can recognize each other given the opportunity for fertility effects. Had I been clever, I might have said, aha, there are chemicals that strip methyl groups off. If all the methyl groups are taken away, then the match between any two individuals is perfect. Outbreeding depression goes away altogether, and so, for that matter, does inbreeding depression. I was not clever, but they went ahead and did it anyway. Sure enough, when they raised seeds with chemicals that stripped out the methyl groups, inbred plants lost their inbreeding depression. It seems highly probable that all animals as well as plants have reduced fertility with reduced kinship based on a post-zygotic epigenetic mechanism. So if every other largish living thing has more babies if it mates with reasonably close kin, what about humans? We choose how many babies we want, right? Wrong. Well, right. but the choice is made at the altar, not years down the road. Look at this. What a group led by Agnar Helgason did was look at a cohort of Iceland couples. They went back 10 generations and added up ancestors. On the basis of that, they calculated whether the couples were second cousins or closer, third cousins or closer, and so forth. This is not the same as standard English usage, but we'll go with it. You can go back later if you like, just add it to that list. First, we'll look at the number of grandchildren a couple had. As you can see, when kinship is very close, there is a fall in fertility. In this regard, marrying a second cousin is not so bad as marrying a sixth cousin, but it is not so good as marrying a third or fourth cousin. The numbers have been normalized, meaning compared with the average for the country for the years in question. Something of this importance, I rather wish the raw data were given, but as you can see, there is indeed inbreeding depression for humans. It's just not as severe as outbreeding depression. So we can rest assured that both the phenomena are due to a post-zygotic mechanism. The right side of the graph is just like the Sibley curve we saw earlier. These people all can't possibly know all their ancestors back 10 generations, so we aren't looking at choice except that they have chosen each other. The statistics are very clean. The number of grandchildren depends on kinship and nothing else. The team also looked at the number of children. Children should be governed mostly by a prezygotic mechanism, but there could be a postzygotic element. A zygote that didn't divide even once would not result in a recognized pregnancy. It would be a missing child, although in the matter of pre- and postzygotic mechanisms, it should be counted as a missing grandchild. So yes, humans are subject to both prezygotic and postzygotic population limiting processes, and again the curve at more distantly related degrees of kinship is the same Sibley curve. They also looked at something similar in Denmark. Here the comparison was with couples born varying distances apart rather than directly from their genealogies. Superficially, the right-hand side of the graph looks different, but that is because they've measured marital radius, which is, of course, proportional to the square root of the area and thus of population. Correct for that, and the curves are the same. There is inbreeding depression visible. This team, in an earlier publication, looked specifically for choice. They found that once townside and marital radius were accounted for, and that is taking kinship out of the picture, there was no further effect of education or income on family size. It is simply not choice. It's all the epigenetic match. It's all kinship. Sure, there are such things as fires, floods, famines, plagues, and wars. They can affect a population size, but their biggest effect is probably the degree to which they force people to move around and meet other groups or isolate themselves in small groups. At all events, such things are not a major feature of life in Iceland and Denmark these days, and when they happen, they are easily identified and dealt with on their own terms. So, specifically in the mammals, do we always get damped oscillation? That question was answered long ago by a man named Calhoun. Calhoun was interested in the psychology of overcrowding, so he put 4 male and 4 female mice in a large cage, provided all the food and water and bedding material they needed, and watched them for years. The population died out. Calhoun did make some intriguing observations that tempt one to compare certain of his mice with modern metrosexuals and the herbivores of Japan, but let's not go there. I'm ignoring this. If you want to go back later, you know how it goes. He concluded that overcrowding, even though there was always room for more mice, was doing psychological damage and predicted civilization would unravel in 1992. You might think he was pretty close on that one, but let's look at his numbers. All live births stop at about day 600. Now, if a mouse generation is 2 months in a Calhoun cage, change that later if you like, that's 10 generations from the time the population takes off at a gallop and the last birth. What would happen if you did the same experiment with humans? Let's look at a couple of possibilities first. Suppose civilizations only collapse because of wars, climate, epidemics, or other things that arise outside of the population. The chance of a civilization unraveling or collapsing then would be independent of age. Here it is graphed as a flat, straight line. No matter what the age of the civilization, its chance of collapsing over the next 50 years is always the same. I mean, you might be able to see it coming, but if all you know is the age, it's no help. An alternative would be that civilizations collapse because of something within the population. Populations in different civilizations will have different religions, different political systems, different technologies, possibly different genes. If any of these confer an advantage, then the less blessed civilizations should die off quickly, and those that survive should have an ever-increasing life expectancy, or as shown here, increasing chance of surviving the next 50 years. Climate change could work either way. If the change happened because of something like volcanoes, then it would be outside the population. If it happened because of burning fossil fuels, then it would be related to events within the population. Of course, a reasonable person would suggest that some civilizations collapse because of internal factors and some because of external factors. When you add both lines, you wind up with another rising line, effectively indistinguishable from the one here. So let's look at Egypt from its first flowering to the beginning of the 20th century. Sure enough, the line rises until civilizations are dropping out one by one with numbers too small to be meaningful. But notice what happens as you approach 300 years, which I make to be about 10 generations. There is a drop in the survival expectancy. That was not expected. It cannot be because of anything inside the population, anything outside the population, or any combination. It can only be because of the very fact of a population. And since it occurs roughly on the same generation as Calhoun's mice stopping having pups, one can refine it and say it is a population of sufficient size for a sufficient number of generations so that the fertility has crashed. That will bring down a civilization, all right, every time. It could be a fluke, so we'll look at a similarly long history of southern Mesopotamia over the same thousands of years. It's the same crash at 300 years. Of course, Egypt has an unusual geography, pretty much consisting of one long Nile Valley and then the Delta. It has to be hard to set up a government, which difficulty might indeed be reflected in greater survival likelihood of governments that are old enough to collapse. Or maybe the geography limits mating pool size sufficiently for the elite to escape the Calhoun doom. So let's look elsewhere. Combining Rome, the classical Mayans, and the Anasazi of Chaco Canyon, we get the same curve over the same time. Isaac Newton's last book was a history book. I went through it and pulled out all the ages of regimes I could find and analyzed them the same way. Newton's history works out the same way as everybody else. In the same book, he says that a generation lasts 32 years as opposed to a reign, which generally involved an older son and lasted 30 years. He also mentioned and immediately changed the meaning of the remark that no regime outlasts 9 generations. If you go back to the graph of the Icelandic couples, you will see that there is no mention of 9th cousins. They went back 10 generations but found nobody with no consanguinity for that long. 9 generations. Yes? 10? No. Newton is vindicated centuries later. Now, it seems to me that in order to have the highest degree of shared ancestry of the couples under the circumstances of the study, it is probable that the parents of the couples also shared a lot of ancestry, and conversely, to get the lowest degree of shared ancestry, then the parents had low degrees. I don't have a formal proof of that. My computer might be able to do it, but I'm not clever enough to get that out of it. Feel free to add it to the list of things that you're going to throw out at the end, maybe at the top of that list. All right, if we accept Newton's veiled remark indicating a regime change must occur within 9 generations, and his estimate of 32 years per generation, that's 288 years. I've said between 250 and 300 maximum time between regime changes myself. If the American era started with the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, our next regime change will be in 2069. If it started with the Boston Tea Party, that would be 10 years earlier. And regime changes are most unpleasant. You remember the terror of the French Revolution? The Nazis came to power in a bloodbath and left in a bloodbath. There are plenty of descendants of the Whigs of the American War of Independence, but I have never met a descendant of a Tory in the United States. It's not just the last 2 or 3 centuries. All those regime changes we were looking at earlier were about the same. The invaders came in, burned the towns, and killed the elite. It is hard to escape the belief that the elite were all very old. If we are to fall in 2069, I suspect the youngest policeman will be 30 and his mother 70. She is already among us. Now it's time to tidy up our thinking a little bit. I promised that you could toss out anything you weren't convinced of so long as you understood it. Now would be a good time to do that. It's fine to keep anything you like, but for now their purpose has been solved. Just keep one thing, the Sibley curve. You know, or you can go back and review, why this curve had to exist. You know what the result of the curve has been, and even how it has affected history. You don't have to keep all that in mind or even buy into it, but this curve is going nowhere. There are thousands of people who contributed to finding it. That many people aren't going to keep a secret if they have no reason to. That is the Dinkum oil. Now prepare to simplify it even more. Throw out the curve and just think about this. If you marry a relative, you will have more children and grandchildren. Now follow the logic. Children resemble their parents. Some is genetic, some is taught. For now it doesn't matter how much of either. There is a selective advantage in avoiding outsiders. So here's how it works. Consider that people vary. One way in which they vary is how nice they are. So we shall oversimplify and simply say there are nice people who try to do what is right and what will make people happy, and mean people who just don't care what people think or feel. So here we have a nice person who will try to do what is right and makes other people feel good. And we have a mean person who doesn't care what other people think or feel. Obviously, we want to live with nice people, so we tell everybody, Be nice now. Love everybody, particularly love outsiders. And then somebody falls in love. There are nice people and not so nice people everywhere. So what happens next? The nice people do as they are told and marry outsiders. They have fewer babies, and after a few generations, no babies. The family is not as nice as it was. Since this is true of every family, the world is a dark and terrible place. We see that all the time. On the other hand, you could tell people, be nice, but you keep your pants on out there. You need to marry kin or you harm your children. Now it's only the mean ones who marry outside. And now that line is smaller and in a few generations dies out. So the family on average is a lot nicer. Since that is true of every family you could reach, the world is a lot nicer place. And that is all there is to it.